All right, we will go ahead and begin. We are in this is our seventh lesson, our seventh class period, including the online classes. And we are still in chapter 9, lesson number 9 in the book, Unraveling Evolution by Joshua Gertler. Hope you've had time to read through that and answer those questions to get more familiar with the material for us to study tonight. This is one of my favorite parts, one of the most exciting parts of the study of creation evolution, which has to do more with the flood, I guess, than creation. Of course, it has a lot to do with creation, because that's where the creatures came from, who were fossilized during the flood. But just to kind of give us a idea of where we are now, I'm changing up one thing. We're flipping one of the lessons around. Tonight we're finishing up lesson 9 on the fossil record, and then I thought it's going to be a good idea to go on into the flood. Since we're talking about fossil record, let's skip lesson 10 for more than one reason, but one good thing about it is that we can study the flood directly after we talk about fossils. Because as I said, I believe the flood is where all those animals were buried and became fossilized. So we'll skip 10 and we'll go into 11 and 12, talk about the ape-man question. Did we evolve from apes? But we won't spend just a tremendous amount of time on that chapter because there's such little information, even from evolutionists, about our so-called evolving from apes. So we'll go 11 and then 12, and then we'll jump back to 10 and talk about that newer theory of evolution, because the Darwinian model of evolution has been so bereft of evidence. They came up with something else called punctuated equilibrium. So we'll talk about that one after we do 11 and 12. Then we go back into 4 and 5, theistic evolution, where people are trying to combine evolution and God together because they know that evolution doesn't work by itself. So they're trying to make both sides happy, and then they make nobody happy. That's the way it normally works with people who try to compromise. And then we go into the ultimate proof of creation. We'll probably spend 4 classes on that. And we're going to be looking at things maybe a different way than you're used to. But hopefully it will be interesting and exciting to you to learn some new things. They won't be new to you, but it'll be just a different way of looking at the creation evolution question. All right, we've talked a little bit about circular reasoning, and I'm drilling this into you so you can spot people when they do circular reasoning. People just have a way of asserting something and saying, this is fact. And then they try to give a proof for it, and their proof is just the statement again, that it is fact. For instance, somebody might say, this dinosaur fossil, this dinosaur is 120 million years old. Well, how do you know that? Well, it was found in a 120 million year old rock. Oh, okay, well, how do you know it was a 120 million year old rock? Well, because the index fossils that are in that rock, are 120 million years old. And then once again, how do you know that those index fossils are 120 million years old? Well, because we know from their stage of evolution how old they are, how old they should be. In other words, nothing proves anything. It all just comes back to the assumption and the assertion of evolution. That's what they start with. That's what they end with. Any evidence to the contrary must be false evidence. So we are looking at the fossil record. Okay, when we talk about the fossil record, we're just talking about when we dig up fossils, they are telling us something. We kind of think of fossils as having recorded something. And so we can play it back. What did the fossils tell us? What is the record that they present to us? And what are they trying to say? The fossil record is a history of a long succession of evolutionary progression, according to them. But if it is, then it should be filled with transitional forms. Okay, do you remember the discussion in the book about transitional forms? Well, that is animals who should be transitioned between one type and another type, or one kind and another kind, one phylum and another phylum. I don't know if you guys have done much study about biology or paleontology. I don't know, fossils, classifications of animals, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Are you familiar with that at all? Kingdom, animal kingdom, plant kingdom. Kingdom, phylum, those are separated more. Class, order, family, genus, species is how animals and plants are classified. So, according to Darwin himself, he said that if my theory is true, then there should be just tons of transitional forms found in the earth. But of course, when he wrote his book, he believed that the fossil record was incomplete. We didn't have as many fossils. We didn't have many fossils that they had dug up. And so he knew, there aren't any transitional fossils that we found yet, or there are very few. But he just knew that they would be found in subsequent years. And so, even though it was damaging to his theory at the time that there were very few transitional fossils, it was not fatal to his theory because there just weren't that many fossils, species or specimens that had been dug up. So, after he wrote his book and said there must be millions and tons of transitional fossils out there for us to discover, then it became an obsession for people to go out and find them. So almost all, 99.9% of all paleontological work has been done, that is, digging up fossils, has been done since Darwin's book came out. 99.9% of fossil digging and fossil discovery has occurred since Darwin's book came out. And there are very few currently known species were known to Darwin because they had not been discovered yet. But in that period of time, we have found about 100,000 different fossil species. Over 100 million fossils have been dug up. 100 million specimens have been dug up, representing about 100,000 different fossil species. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you start with, in fact, it starts before that, it starts with domain. Domain meaning one cell versus multi-cell. So once you get into multi-cell, which makes up most of the fossils, of course, then you get into the kingdom, and this is the animal kingdom, Animalia, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Well, in this fossil record, let's consider the transition from a land mammal to a whale. And that's what they said happened. It's kind of funny. They said that the first living thing evolved in the water, in some kind of goop or primordial soup, they call it. And it came up out of the water. But then later, after it had evolved into mammal, they went back into the water and evolved into marine mammals like whales. So let's think about what would have to happen for a land mammal to actually evolve into a whale. Now, y'all know that a whale is a mammal. It's not a fish. It breathes air. It gives birth to live young, and it nurses its young like all mammals do. So, in this so-called transition they believe happened, the forelimb, that is, it crawled on all fours, the forelimb, the front legs, would have to transition into fins. Okay, they say that's no problem. But somehow the tail fluke would have to, the rear fin. By the way you can tell a mammal from a fish, the tail fluke of a mammal goes up and down, like in a whale or a dolphin. But a fish goes side to side. So you can look at a swimming animal and tell right away whether it's a fish or whether it's a mammal. So evolution of tail flukes, where did they come from? They would have had to evolve somehow. And streamlining the body to make it where it will slide through the water where he can swim. And the reduction of the hind limbs. The hind limbs that were there, but now they've got to go away and be reduced so that they don't hinder the swimming. And here's the funniest one to me. The nostrils, where he breathes, would have to somehow migrate up to the top of his head. So he breathes through the top of his head. And how that does not present a problem for them and make them question their theory is a mystery to me. But also there would be drastic changes in behavior, like changing from a terrestrial habitat, that is walking around on the land, to living in the water in a marine habitat. And development of other habits like migration habits that didn't exist before. Now, a whale will migrate hundreds or even thousands of miles every year to give birth. Why do they do that? How does that? It's a migratory instinct. We're going to talk about instinct coming up in a future class, and how that could have possibly developed if evolution is true. And I'll give you a little hint. They have no answer. But these migratory instincts would have had to evolve and develop in this animal who used to live on the land. So many different changes would have had to take place for a land animal to evolve into a marine mammal. And how many thousands of intermediate species would be required for this evolution to take place? Think about that. You've got a walking, breathing land animal, and then evolved into a marine mammal. How long would that have taken? All right, you got that number in your mind. How many millions of years that would have taken? Well, how many thousands of intermediate species would be required for that transition to take place? But not a single fossil of such an imaginary creature has ever been found. But they say it's true. They say they did make that evolution. We just haven't found the fossils. But this here is an important fact in this. This is only one of the many hundreds of such transitions that would have had to take place. I'm just talking about from land mammal to marine mammal. That's just one. What about all the hundreds of other transitions that would have had to take place for the theory of evolution to be true? It doesn't even speak of the transitions from one major group to another, like from invertebrates to vertebrates. Where did the backbone come from? And we don't have any transitional forms of fossils showing that transition. But it would have taken millions of years, and millions of intermediate species would have evolved, but we have not one of them preserved in the fossil record. Reptile to bird, we talked about that one earlier when we talked about reptile lungs to bird lungs, and the evolution of mammals, period, before they even went into the water. You know, I like to talk about or quote evolutionists when they admit the trouble they have with their theory. So let's look at this one. We're going to study this quote a little bit. Simon C. Morris said, "There is no coherent phylogeny." Okay, that's a lot of big words there, but a phylogeny is a supposed evolutionary history. Coherent meaning, it makes sense. There is no coherent phylogeny or evolutionary history for the roughly 35 metazoan, multicellular, metazoan phyla exists. So in other words, we can't figure out. Let me just keep reading, and then we'll analyze this. No, there's no coherent phylogeny for the roughly 35 metazoan phyla. The morphological gaps that by definition separate phyla remain inviolate. That is, they are safe from violation. Those gaps are there. He says we remain uninformed both about the now extinct intermediates and the evolutionary processes that would have been responsible for the diversification of early multicellular animals. This is a tremendously embarrassing quote, and just an admission that they don't have near as much evidence as they would try to make you believe they do. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. He says there's no coherent phylogeny, that is, no history of evolution that makes any sense. Evolutionists have not developed a plausible hypothetical evolutionary pathway of single-celled to multicellular animals. In other words, they can't write it out, they can't draw it out from their imagination and design something just on paper, much less find evidence of it. They can't even come up with something from their imagination. He said the morphological gaps that by definition separate phyla. Now see, the only way we are able to classify organisms into the phyla, classes, orders, species, etc., is because of the gaps between them. If evolution were true, there would be no gaps. It would be a smooth transition from one type to another type. Okay, that's an important fact in all this. There would be no clear gaps. Okay, so because evolution would just be a smooth transition over a long period of time, and between the, let's say, the land mammals and the marine mammals, there would be, they wouldn't be extinct species, there would be many species even living today that were kind of halfway in between. So the classifications of kingdom, phylum, class, order, etc., would not even be possible because they would not be clearly defined gaps. All right, he also said we remained uninformed about the now extinct intermediates that I was just talking about. These transitional forms are absolutely essential to their theory, but there is no evidence that they ever even existed. Their existence is totally imaginary. They made it up. He said we also remain uninformed about any evolutionary processes that would have been required to bring about evolution. He said evolutionary scientists have not discovered any biological mechanisms that can account for the incredible diversity of complex life on Earth. So if somebody were testifying to this in court of law, the case would be thrown out. The case for evolution would just be completely thrown out. Because he's admitted we have no evidence. We can't even make up a scenario of how it could have taken place. But evolution goes merrily along. So they admit that there's no fossil evidence for evolution. They admit that they haven't developed a plausible, hypothetical evolutionary pathway. They admit that we are completely ignorant of any processes by which evolution might have occurred, but with all the confidence that usually goes with ignorance, they say humans evolved from pond scum. Exclamation point. That is a fact, they say. But they very clearly admit, when they let their guard down, that we don't have evidence to support it. So the absence of intermediates in the fossil record is a mystery, and it's an embarrassment to evolutionists. But it is predicted and expected from the creation model of origins. It's exactly what the Bible says. What does it say? I'm going to let y'all finish this one. They will reproduce after their kind. They will reproduce after their kind. The Bible says that. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we find. Not only in the living world, but in the fossil record. But this is a major problem to evolutionists. It's a mystery, and it's a major embarrassment to them. Trumpet fanfare. We're going to look at creatures that defy evolution. In case y'all don't know this is something that just pops up every once in a while. You never know when it's going to come. We're going to look at creatures that God has created that have no evolutionary explanation. Today we are talking about your friend and mine. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him, the Bombardier Beetle. You ever heard of the Bombardier Beetle? Anybody? This is a fun little guy. And I say little, he's about a half-inch long, just small little beetle. But in his body, he combines two chemicals, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide. First of all, he produces those chemicals, and he combines them in the right amounts. And he secretes them into two storage chambers. So they have the little glands that make the chemicals, secretes them down the little pipe into a storage chamber, and there those chemicals, those mixed chemicals, kind of sit, and they're inert. They don't do anything. But then, when he needs to use his weapon, he adds a third chemical, an enzyme, a catalyst, that accelerates the chemical reaction into combustion chambers, and the result is an explosion of hot liquid and gases that can even injure or kill his enemies, those who are trying to eat him. And it's very painful. It's very distasteful. It's hot. It's so hot that it's the same temperature as boiling water. And he spits it out that quickly. Little drawing here of what it looks like inside. You have see if I can. Did that show up? No. Okay. Here are the glands that create those two chemicals. And it goes into the storage chambers, and then it goes down into the combustion chamber, and it waits, or reaction chamber, and it just waits there until he needs to use it. Then he squirts the catalyst, the enzyme, in there, which activates those two chemicals and allows them to explode in a hot, gaseous explosion into the mouth of the predator as it comes along. and tries to eat the guy. Just another picture showing the beetle aiming. Evolutionists have no explanation for this. Well, I should take that back. They didn't for decades. When people were trying to analyze this little animal, and they admit this was a major problem for them to imagine how two chemicals could have been evolved and they didn't do anything until that third chemical evolved, and then he could squirt that enzyme into that mixture and it would squirt. But not until he evolved that combustion chamber. It's a tiny little combustion chamber that kept the rest of his body from exploding. It's got to be strong, so it aims it out from the body. All that had to evolve at the right time, in the right sequence of events. Or it's like the eye we talked about recently. A partially evolved defense mechanism like this does no good. Until it's completely and fully in place, it doesn't make any sense. But God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beasts of the earth after his kind." And it was so. God said, "I want creeping things on the earth." So you want to know where the little Bombardier Beetle came from? God told us. Remember Romans chapter 1? We talked about this very early on in our third class. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. The invisible things of him are clearly seen. That is, his eternal power and Godhead. And they are understood by the things he made. His eternal power and deity or Godhead. So that they are without excuse. Those who try to come up with evolutionary explanations for things that God has created are without excuse. He has made it clear by the things that he has made, that he does exist, that he has power, all power, and that he is deity, he is God. All right, so we want to talk about the fossil record. According to evolutionists, the fossil record, what they dig up, the 100 million specimens that they have, not species, but specimens of fossils that they have dug up, is the fossil record. Despite the tremendous increase in geological activity in every corner of the globe, the infinitude of connecting links has still not been discovered. And the fossil record is about as discontinuous as it was when Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, his book. That's Michael Denton. In this book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. As I said before, this guy is an evolutionist, but he knows that Darwinian evolution is false. It cannot be supported. And he says the infinitude, that is the incredible number of connecting links between the different kinds, has still not been discovered. And the fossil record still has as many gaps as it ever had. T. Neville George said, "There is no need to apologize any longer for the poverty of the fossil record." In other words, people like Darwin said, well, there's just not that many fossils yet. But when we dig them up, everything will be fine. We'll have transitional fossils galore. Well, they haven't found them. He said there's no need to apologize any longer for the poverty, that is, the lack of fossils. In some ways, it has become almost unimaginably rich. And discovery is outpacing integration. That is, we're digging them up faster than we can analyze them and categorize them and integrate them into the fossil record. He says the fossil record, nevertheless, continues to be composed mainly of gaps. The gaps have not been filled. Robert Barnes said the fossil record tells us almost nothing about the evolutionary origin of phyla and classes. Intermediate forms are non-existent, undiscovered, or not recognized. I can answer that. They are non-existent. There are no transitional fossils because there were no transitional animals. N. Herbert Nilsson said it is not even possible to make a caricature of evolution out of the paleobiological facts. A caricature. Have you ever seen a drawing of a person where they emphasize some characteristic of that person? That's called a caricature. It's not an exact representation. They're trying to exaggerate something. We can't even make a drawing. We can't even come up with a caricature. That is a funny depiction of how it might have looked out of the paleobiological, that is, the fossils of animals. We can't even come up with anything. The fossil material is now so complete that the lack of transitional series cannot be explained as due to the scarcity of the material. In other words, we can't just say, well, we just don't have enough fossils anymore. Can't say that because the deficiencies are real, that is, the gaps. They will never be filled. Okay. Evolutionists admitting they will never be able to fill these transitional gaps. Have you ever heard anybody say the missing link? Missing link, singular, as though all we got to find is one missing link and evolution is clear. No. There are hundreds of missing links, and actually thousands or even millions of missing links between the types and the kinds and the phyla and the classes of animals. And they have finally come to admit that they will never be able to fill those gaps. W.E. Swinton, the origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence of the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. But you're telling me it did happen, though. Oh, yeah, it did happen. I don't know how. We don't have any evidence of it, but it did happen. Turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. Always a good place to go when we're talking about creation. Genesis chapter 1. Look at verse 9. Ben, can I get you to read 9 and 10? Genesis 1, verses 9 and 10.
God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters upon the seas, and God saw that it was good.
All right, Grant, would you read 11 through 13?
Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the earth that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the earth that yields seed according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, so the evening and the morning were good.
All right. Anna, would you read 20 through 22?
Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth."
Titus, would you read 23 through 25?
So the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beasts of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Oh, yeah."
Yep. I tell you what, let's read that. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's the answer. And don't yield for an hour. Don't yield to these evolutionists, professors, teachers, and all of the so-called scientists and entertainment people, news media, all those things we've talked about. Don't listen to them because they are godless. They are even anti-God. But you have the truth, and you have the evidence on your side. But if the evidence is so overwhelming as we've been discussing in this class, why don't they just give it up? Why don't they fall down in repentance and come to Christ, realizing that the Bible is true and has the answers? They don't do that. Why is that? We're going to talk about that when we talk about the ultimate proof of creation. Okay? There's a main reason why people don't do that in spite of all the evidence. In other words, we can't just get on a debate stage and start throwing facts at each other, because that doesn't convince either side. We're both looking at the same facts. We're both looking at the same fossil record. We're both looking at the same experimental results from scientific experiments in the lab. So we just throw these back and forth at each other, and neither side makes a move to come to the other side. We're going to talk about why that is true when we get to the ultimate proof of creation. The Cambrian Explosion. Okay, this is, once again, these are the geologic time scale. Cambrian, Triassic, Jurassic, and all those ages. The Cambrian Explosion began supposedly 530 million years ago, and it contains abundant fossils of complex invertebrates like clams, snails, trilobites, sponges, brachiopods, worms, jellyfish. I said invertebrates, but they've also discovered vertebrate fishes in the Cambrian level. And this is a sudden appearance. That's why they call it an explosion of animals that didn't exist before. The sudden appearance of these abundant fossils is called the Cambrian Explosion. Precambrian, which was 530 million years up to 3.5 billion years ago, has virtually no fossils in it. So you see here, you got the Cambrian period, 530 million years ago, boom, an explosion of life. But fossils before that are virtually non-existent. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God saw the great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind. That's where the explosion is. This is the explosion of life. God brought them forth abundantly, where they didn't exist before. Axelrod says one of the major unsolved problems of geology and evolution is the occurrence of diversified, multicellular marine invertebrates in lower Cambrian rocks on all the continents of the world, and their absence in rocks of greater age. In other words, we've got the Precambrian sedimentary rock. It was laid down by water, which we're going to talk about in the next class. I know because I've already recorded it. So I'm going to go ahead and post that pretty soon for the Sunday class. when we're talking about the flood. But Precambrian rock has layers, but there are no fossils in it. And I say virtually none. Really, I think there are actually none in it. But all of a sudden, the Cambrian, there's just an abundance. This is one of the major unsolved problems in geology and evolution. However, when we turn to examine the Precambrian rocks for the forerunners of these early Cambrian fossils, in other words, what evolved into all these animals, they are nowhere to be found. We don't have any precursors to the Cambrian fossils. The sediments apparently were suitable for the preservation of fossils in the Precambrian because they are so often identical with overlying rocks. In other words, Precambrian rock looks the same as Cambrian rock, but there are no fossils in it. Why? Because the animals did not exist. No fossils are found in them. Richard Dawkins, another militant anti-creationist. Not only is he for evolution, but he is anti-creationist. He says the Cambrian rocks, strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years ago, now dated 530 million years ago, which is the Cambrian, are the oldest in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution. The very first time they appeared. That's why it's called an explosion. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Well, yeah, I mean, sorry, but that's what the truth is. That's what we predict. That's what we expect based on the Word of God. That's what the Bible says, that there's not going to be any evolutionary history. You say it's to our delight. It's not to our delight as much as it is just what we expect, and we teach it as the truth. Yeah, it is as though they were just planted there. God planted them there with no evolutionary precursors. This explosion of life in the Cambrian age, in the fossil record, is a mystery and an embarrassment to evolutionists. But it is predicted and expected in the creation model of origins. Okay, I hope y'all can see that I get kind of animated when I talk about this, because I just want you to know that you have the truth and that there is a poverty of evidence on the evolutionary side. They don't have the evidence, that they try to act like, well, of course we know it. Evolution has been proven over and over and over. That's all they say. But they don't show how it's been proven, because it can't. It hasn't been proven. But when they have to examine their evidence, when we call for their evidence, we find that it is non-existent. All right. There is our knock, so we will break. Appreciate you coming. And as I said, we will jump into the flood next time. We will skip lesson 10 and go straight into lesson 11, talk about catastrophism and the global flood.